I am Caroline, 33 years old. 2 days after leaving the military hospital with my newborn twins, my husband walked into our kitchen with his arm wrapped around his wealthy boss. He tossed divorce papers onto the granite counter, smirked, and told me to sign them because she was carrying his real heir. My mother-in-law screamed at me to take my babies and get out into the freezing snow. What they did not know was that the unemployed veteran they were kicking out had secretly bought the very company they worked for. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My body was still entirely numb from the emergency surgical delivery. I stood in the doorway of the house I had secretly paid the mortgage on for the last 3 years, clutching my 2 newborn babies tightly in their heavy carriers. The harsh winter wind was howling behind me, pushing bitter snow against my ankles. But the emotional chill inside the house was far worse. My husband Bradley was standing casually by the kitchen island. He was not looking at his children. He did not rush forward to help me carry them inside or ask how my recovery was going. Instead, he was busy pouring a glass of expensive champagne for Meredith, the 42-year-old vice president of Vanguard Tech. Meredith was Bradley's boss. Right now, her manicured hand was resting intimately against his chest, her fingers tracing the lapel of his tailored suit with a sickening familiarity. I shifted the heavy carriers, the fresh surgical staples pulling painfully at my abdomen with every tiny movement. I expected shock. I expected him to jump back and offer a pathetic excuse for why another woman was in our home. Instead, Bradley took a slow sip of his champagne, reached into his leather briefcase, and tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the kitchen island. "Sign it," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am not playing house anymore. Meredith is carrying my actual heir. I am done pretending to be a charity worker for a washed-up veteran who has been living off my health insurance just to afford fertility treatments." I stared at the divorce papers, the harsh reality of his words echoing in the pristine kitchen. He was calling my beautiful, hard-fought 4 twins test tube mistakes. He was calling me a charity case. He was erasing an entire decade of marriage in a single breath, standing right next to the woman he had clearly been sleeping with for months while I was enduring a high-risk pregnancy. Meredith stepped forward, adjusting her designer cashmere coat. She looked at my sensible winter boots and my exhausted pale face with absolute disgust. She leaned against the marble counter, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "He needs a woman who understands corporate strategy," Caroline Meredith sneered, swirling the champagne in her glass. "He needs someone who can navigate boardrooms and handle multi-million-dollar accounts. Not someone who spent her 20s playing soldier in the desert and her 30s being completely unemployed in my subordinate's house. You have been holding him back for years, and he finally woke up to reality." Her words were meant to cut deep and establish dominance. For the past 5 years, ever since I left active duty in military logistics and intelligence, Bradley and his entire circle believed I was just a struggling veteran. I let them believe I was collecting a meager disability check, spending my days baking and watching daytime television. Bradley constantly complained to his friends about how he had to carry the financial burden of our household on his mid-level manager salary. He loved playing the martyr. He loved the control it gave him. He loved feeling superior to the woman who used to outrank him in every conceivable way before we got married. What Bradley did not know, what no one in this house knew, was that my laptop was not used for finding recipes or clipping coupons. During my service, I had built a massive intelligence and logistics network. When I got out, I founded Aegis Global, a cybersecurity and defense supply chain corporation that had just crossed $1 billion in valuation. I was not unemployed. I was the silent CEO of an empire. My security clearance required an incredibly low profile, which was the only reason I allowed the house and cars to remain in Bradley's name. But looking at the two of them standing there dripping in arrogance and unearned pride, I kept my face entirely blank. I did not shed a single tear. Military training teaches you how to compartmentalize trauma, how to assess a threat, and how to strike only when the enemy has exposed their weakest flank. Let them feel powerful. Let them dig their own graves. Before I could even respond to Meredith's pathetic attempt at an insult, heavy footsteps thudded from the second floor. My mother-in-law Brenda came storming down the mahogany staircase. She was dragging two large black garbage bags behind her. The bags were bulging, tearing at the seams from the sheer volume of items stuffed inside. With a vicious heave, Brenda hurled them over the banister. They crashed onto the hardwood floor right at my feet, bursting open to reveal my winter coats, my civilian clothes, and the few framed photos I had of my old military unit. "Get your test tube mistakes out of my son's house!" Brenda screamed, her face red with rage, as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "I told Bradley years ago he should not marry a piece of military trash like you. You bring nothing to this family. You have no money, no class, and no future. You are a leech. Now pick up your garbage and get out before I call the police for trespassing." The babies started to cry, their tiny voices piercing the tense air, reacting to the sudden loud noises and the hostile environment. The sound tore at my heart, but I forced myself to remain stoic, despite the searing pain in my stomach. I looked at Bradley, the man I had vowed to spend my life with, waiting for even a flicker of hesitation or regret as his own mother threw his newborn children out into a blizzard. He just took Meredith's hand and smirked, sipping his champagne, waiting for me to break down and beg. He wanted me to fall to my knees. He wanted me to cry. He was severely underestimating the woman he had married. Brenda stepped forward, her eyes flashing with greedy opportunism. She was not satisfied with simply throwing my clothes out into the brutal Boston winter. Her gaze locked onto the side pocket of my diaper bag, where a glimmer of gold chain was peeking out. It was my grandmother's antique necklace, a family heirloom that had survived generations. Brenda lunged for it, her manicured fingers diving into the fabric. "I will take this as payment for the rent you owe us," she snarled, her voice shrill and entitled. My military reflexes kicked in before my conscious mind even registered the threat. I did not drop the baby carrier in my left hand. Instead, my right hand shot out with terrifying speed. I grabbed Brenda's wrist, twisted it precisely at the joint, and slammed her arm flat against the cold granite of the kitchen island. Brenda shrieked in pain, her knees buckling as the downward pressure locked her in place. Meredith took a sudden, frightened step backward, nearly knocking over her champagne glass, the smug superiority momentarily wiped from her face. Bradley stood frozen, unable to comprehend that the woman he thought was a weak dependent had just neutralized his mother in a split second. I leaned in close, keeping my voice soft and completely devoid of emotion. "Do not ever touch my family heirlooms," I told her, making sure she felt the unyielding iron in my grip. "And do not ever reach toward my children again." I released her wrist, and Brenda stumbled back, cradling her arm against her chest and whimpering like a wounded animal. Bradley quickly recovered his bravado, stepping in front of Meredith to protect his new prize. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit pocket and held it up for me to see. "You think you are so tough because of your military background?" he sneered, tapping the screen with deliberate, exaggerated motions. "Let us see how far your combat training gets you in the real world. I just canceled our joint credit card. Your access is completely gone. Good luck paying for a cab in a blizzard freeloader." He locked his phone and shoved it back into his pocket. "Let us see how you survive with $0 to your name. Now get your trash out of my house." I did not waste my breath arguing. I adjusted my grip on the heavy infant carriers, turned my back on them, and walked straight toward the front door. I pulled it open, and the freezing winter wind instantly lashed across my face. I stepped out into the howling storm, and the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me, locking me out of the warmth forever. The cold was immediate and punishing. The snow was blinding, swirling in chaotic vortexes under the dim glow of the streetlights. My boots sank deep into the fresh powder, making every step a grueling effort. I shielded the carriers with my own body, bending forward to block the biting wind from reaching the sleeping twins. Every step I took down the icy concrete driveway sent a shockwave of fiery pain through my surgical incision, but I kept moving. I reached the edge of the sidewalk, the street completely empty and buried under a fresh layer of white. I had no house keys. I had no active credit card. But my mind was already racing, calculating logistics, planning my next strategic move to dismantle their entire lives. Before I could reach into my coat pocket to dial my emergency extraction team, a pair of bright headlights pierced through the whiteout conditions. A sleek, heavily armored black SUV glided down the street, its specialized winter tires gripping the ice with flawless precision. It pulled to a smooth stop directly in front of me. The hazard lights flashed once. The heavy driver's side door swung open, pushing against the wind. Elijah stepped out into the storm. At 36 years old, my brother-in-law was a sharp, fiercely intelligent man. He was married to Bradley's sister Paige, and I knew he had always despised the toxic, arrogant culture of his wife's family. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not waste time expressing shock at finding me standing in a blizzard with newborns. He moved with absolute purpose. Elijah immediately stripped off his heavy cashmere overcoat. He stepped forward and draped the thick, warm fabric directly over the two baby carriers, completely shielding my children from the freezing elements. Without asking, he took the weight of one carrier from my aching arm, his grip solid and reassuring. "Get in," he commanded, his voice easily cutting through the howling wind. He opened the heated rear door of the SUV, and I climbed into the plush leather interior. The sudden rush of warm air was a shock to my freezing skin. Elijah carefully secured both infant bases into the back seat, ensuring the twins were perfectly safe before slamming the heavy door shut. He climbed into the driver's seat, shifted the vehicle into gear, and hit the gas. The SUV powered through the snowbanks, leaving Bradley's house far behind in the rearview mirror. The cabin was heavily soundproofed, reducing the raging blizzard outside to a mere whisper. I let out a slow, trembling breath, allowing the physical adrenaline to fade just enough so I could think clearly. Elijah reached over to the center console and handed me a steaming travel mug of black coffee. The heat radiated through my numb fingers. I drank the coffee, the bitter caffeine sharpening my senses. Then he reached into the passenger seat, picked up a thick leather-bound file, and passed it back to me. I took the file, my eyes immediately catching the gold foil logo stamped across the front cover. It was the corporate seal of Vanguard Tech, the company where Bradley worked and Meredith ruled as vice president. The pages inside were dense with financial data, highlighted routing numbers, and flagged wire transfers. It was a roadmap of corporate theft. It was the exact ammunition I needed. I looked up and met Elijah's reflection in the rearview mirror. "They think they have won," I said softly, my voice barely scratching the quiet of the cabin. "They think they took everything from me." Elijah shook his head, keeping his eyes on the snowy road ahead. "They have no idea who they just declared war on." He tapped the steering wheel with a gloved hand. "I am Vanguard Tech's senior financial auditor," Elijah said, his tone low and steady over the hum of the engine. "Bradley and my lovely wife think I just sit in a cubicle, crunch numbers, and look the other way when they skim off the top. They think you are a nobody. They think you are just a charity case dragging their precious brother down." He smiled, then a sharp, cold expression that promised absolute ruin for the people we had left behind. "But I know the truth, Caroline. I see the routing numbers. I see the encrypted offshore acquisitions passing through the shell companies. I know exactly what you have been building on that laptop for the last 5 years." The tires of the armored SUV gripped the concrete ramp as Elijah steered us into the subterranean parking garage of the tallest glass high-rise in the financial district. We bypassed the guest parking and pulled straight into a private, heavily guarded bay. 2 armed security personnel in tailored suits nodded at Elijah and immediately opened the heavy doors for us. The freezing blizzard above felt like another dimension compared to the sterile, climate-controlled quiet of the garage. I carried the twins, their small bodies warm and completely undisturbed by the chaos we had just left behind. Elijah swiped a black keycard on a restricted elevator panel, and we shot up 40 floors without a single stop. When the steel doors glided open, we stepped into a sprawling penthouse overlooking the snow-covered Boston skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the violent storm outside, but inside the air was perfectly warm, smelling of cedarwood and expensive leather. It was a corporate safe house, one of several luxury properties owned exclusively by my company. Bradley thought my occasional weekend trips were to cheap veteran support retreats. He never knew those trips were executive board meetings, and he certainly never knew I held the deed to the multi-million-dollar penthouse he constantly pointed out admiringly from the street below. I settled the infant carriers onto a massive velvet sectional double, checking my sleeping babies before turning my attention back to Elijah. He had already taken off his coat and was spreading the contents of the thick file across the glass coffee table. The fluorescent glow of the city caught the tension in his jaw. Elijah was a man who lived by the strict rules of finance, and what he was looking at clearly disgusted him. I walked over and looked down at the highlighted routing numbers, forged signatures, and flagged offshore wire transfers. Bradley had always been obsessed with status, but his salary as a mid-level manager at Vanguard Tech barely covered the lavish lifestyle he projected to his country club friends. Now the math made perfect sense. Elijah tapped a freshly printed bank statement with a heavy pen. Meredith and Bradley are not just planning a lavish wedding. They are actively bleeding Vanguard Tech dry to pay for it. They have siphoned over $4 million in the last 6 months alone. They are covering Meredith's massive gambling debts and funneling the rest into untraceable offshore shell companies. I picked up a ledger, my eyes scanning the transaction approvals. Someone internally had to be authorizing these transfers, actively burying them under fake vendor invoices and manipulated expense reports. I looked at Elijah, realizing the heavy toll this audit must have taken on him personally. "Paige is helping them," I stated, not asking a question. Elijah's expression hardened as he nodded. "My own wife, Bradley's sister. Paige is using her senior position in Vanguard accounts payable to wash the stolen funds. They think they are untouchable because they control the internal audits, but they forgot that I report directly to the Federal Compliance Board, not to Meredith. They think you are just a broken veteran they can discard into the cold. They think I am just the token relative they can push around and keep quiet. They have no idea what is actually coming for them." I reached into my bag and pulled out the matte black laptop Bradley had constantly mocked me for staring at all day. I set it on the glass table next to Elijah's damning evidence. As I opened the lid, the screen did not light up with a standard commercial operating system. Instead, a wall of green text scrolled rapidly down the black screen, executing a military-grade biometric encryption sequence. I placed my thumb on the scanner and looked directly into the camera lens. The retinal scan confirmed my identity in a fraction of a second. A mechanized voice chimed softly from the speakers. "Welcome back, founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Global. Security protocols are green." Elijah smiled, a tight, dangerous smile. For 5 years, I had listened to Brenda call me a leech. I had watched Bradley act like a martyr for keeping a roof over my head. I had let Meredith treat me like an uneducated subordinate who was beneath her notice. Meanwhile, I had taken the logistics and cybersecurity network I built during my intelligence deployments and turned it into Aegis Global. We held federal defense contracts that made Vanguard Tech look like a lemonade stand. I was not living in Bradley's shadow. I had been paying for his entire life with the spare change from my dividends, keeping my wealth entirely classified to maintain my federal security clearance. I looked at the divorce papers Bradley had thrown at me earlier. Their crisp white edges mocked the decade of loyalty I had given him. He wanted to throw me out into the snow and build an empire with the woman who was helping him steal. He wanted to claim my children were a mistake while he paraded around with a corporate thief. I tapped a few keys on my laptop, bypassing external firewalls and pulling up the global asset dashboard for Aegis. I did not need to fight Bradley in a messy family court for alimony. I did not need to beg for a portion of the house he thought he owned. I initiated a silent Level 1 corporate acquisition protocol. My legal team was already awake and waiting on standby for my orders. I looked over at Elijah, who was waiting for my command with absolute patience. "Let them have the divorce, Elijah. Let them plan their extravagant wedding with stolen money. They want to play corporate titans and steal from their own investors. We are going to buy Vanguard Tech. 1 week later, the heavy mahogany doors of Boston's most expensive family law mediation office swung open. I sat completely still at the far end of a massive glass conference table, wearing a plain beige sweater and a pair of worn denim jeans. The mediator, a stern-looking man with silver hair, sat at the head of the table, organizing a stack of custody and asset division forms. Bradley strode into the room first. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than his monthly salary. Meredith was right beside him, her arm looped possessively through his. She was draped in a stark white designer dress and dripping in diamond jewelry that I knew for a fact had been purchased using the funds they were currently embezzling from Vanguard Tech. They did not look like two people arriving for a somber legal proceeding. They looked like they were walking the red carpet at a victory celebration. Meredith pulled out a leather chair and sat down directly across from me. She placed her $5,000 handbag on the table, making sure the gold logo faced my direction. Bradley sat next to her, dropping a thin manila folder onto the glass surface. He did not ask how the twins were doing. He did not ask how my surgical recovery was progressing. He just looked at me with absolute contempt. "Let us make this quick," Bradley said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "My time is incredibly valuable, and Meredith has a board meeting at noon. I am offering you a standard exit package, Caroline. You take the meager belongings you left with, and you sign over full primary custody of the twins to me." The mediator frowned and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Bradley, that is highly irregular. Your wife just gave birth to your children. Massachusetts courts generally favor joint custody unless there is a severe risk to the children." Meredith let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "There is a severe risk, sir. Look at her. She is a completely unhinged, washed-up military veteran. She has severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She is volatile. She has zero income. Bradley has been carrying her dead weight for years. If she takes those babies, she will end up living in a homeless shelter by the end of the month." Bradley nodded solemnly, acting like a concerned citizen rather than a man who had literally thrown his recovering wife out into a blizzard. "It is tragic, really," Bradley said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I tried to help her transition back to civilian life, but she simply refuses to work. She has been totally unemployed since she left the service 5 years ago. She contributes absolutely nothing to society or to our household. I cannot let my children be raised by someone so unstable and useless." I sat quietly, keeping my hands folded in my lap. I controlled my breathing, utilizing the exact tactical breathing techniques I used during high-stakes military operations. I let them build their narrative. I let them expose their arrogance. Bradley leaned across the table, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You know you cannot survive on your own, Caroline. You could not even afford your own car without my signature. You begged me to put that cheap sedan in my name because your credit was absolute garbage, and no bank would approve you. You own nothing. You are nothing. If you try to fight me, I will expose your mental instability to a judge and make sure you never see those kids again." He sneered, looking at Meredith for validation. She smiled back at him, patting his hand affectionately. Bradley was entirely correct about the car registration. The vehicle was indeed in his name. What he did not know, and what he was too arrogant to ever investigate, was the reason why. As the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Global, running a multi-billion-dollar international defense network, I was required by federal mandate to maintain the highest level security clearance. That clearance required me to have an absolute zero-profile public footprint. I could not have assets, properties, or even a simple vehicle registration trailing back to my classified civilian identity. I had let Bradley put the car in his name because it served my security protocol perfectly. It fed his massive ego while keeping my corporate empire completely hidden in the shadows. The mediator looked at me with deep pity in his eyes. He clearly believed their story. He saw a broken, defeated woman who was about to be crushed by her wealthy, powerful husband. "Mrs. Bradley," the mediator said gently, tapping his pen against the legal pad, "you do not have to agree to these terms today. In fact, Given the length of your marriage and your lack of current employment, I strongly advise you to fight for spousal support. You are legally entitled to request significant alimony to help you get back on your feet." Meredith scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "If she tries to drain Bradley's bank accounts, we will drag this out in court for years. We have the best corporate lawyers in the city on retainer. We will bury you in legal fees, Caroline, until you are begging us for bus fare. Just sign the papers and walk away with whatever shred of dignity you have left." Bradley slid the separation agreement across the smooth glass table. It stopped right in front of me. The document outlined my complete surrender: 0 alimony, 0 claim to the house, primary custody granted to him. I stared at the thick stack of papers. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump forward perfectly, mimicking the posture of a woman who had completely given up. I let my breathing hitch just slightly, as if I were holding back tears of absolute despair. I reached into my cheap canvas tote bag and slowly pulled out a plain black ballpoint pen. I looked up at Bradley, my eyes wide and seemingly filled with defeat. "I am so tired, Bradley," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly on cue. "I just want this to be over." Bradley grinned, a wide, predatory smile of absolute victory. "Good girl," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sign on the dotted line, and you can go back to being nobody." I uncapped my pen. I was acting utterly defeated and broken, but my mind was operating 10 steps ahead. They thought they were burying me. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the terms of their destruction. The polished concrete floors of Beacon Hill Provisions gleamed under the warm, recessed lighting. It was the kind of ultra-exclusive grocery market where classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the produce was stacked with architectural precision. I stood in the pristine baby aisle, my hands resting lightly on the handle of my cart. Inside sat 6 cans of premium imported European infant formula, the exact brand the pediatrician had recommended for the twins. I was dressed simply in a black cashmere turtleneck and dark jeans, projecting nothing but quiet anonymity. The brutal chaos of the mediation office was exactly 48 hours behind me, and the silent gears of Aegis Global's corporate acquisition protocols were already grinding Vanguard Tech into dust. I reached for a final can of formula when a sudden, violent jolt nearly knocked the cart out of my hands. The heavy metal basket slammed into my hip. I pivoted, my military training instantly evaluating the physical threat. Standing at the end of the aisle, hands gripping her overflowing shopping cart like a weapon, was Brenda. Next to her stood Meredith, draped in a full-length chinchilla coat, holding a custom alligator skin handbag. They were entirely out of place in the quiet grocery store, projecting a loud, aggressive arrogance that immediately drew the eyes of everyone in the surrounding aisles. Brenda did not apologize for ramming the cart. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of theatrical disgust. "Look who crawled out of the snowbank," she loudly announced, making sure her voice carried over the soft symphony music. "I am surprised security even let you walk through the automatic doors. I suppose they cannot screen for pure trash." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed the final can of formula into my basket and locked my eyes onto hers. Brenda thrived on an audience, and sensing the sideways glances from the wealthy shoppers browsing the organic produce section, she amplified her performance. She took a step back and pointed a shaking, dramatic finger directly at my chest. "Everyone be careful around this woman," Brenda projected, her shrill voice echoing down the pristine aisles. "She is an unstable homeless veteran. She has severe psychological issues, and she is actively trying to steal my son's money. She just abandoned her own children and signed away her rights because she is completely unfit to function in civilized society. Keep an eye on your purses." A few shoppers stopped in their tracks, murmuring to one another and casting wary glances in my direction. In their eyes, I was exactly what Brenda described: a broken, dangerous outcast, making a scene in their sanctuary of artisanal cheeses and imported wines. They expected me to yell. They expected me to break down or defend myself. Instead, I maintained a perfectly stoic, blank expression. I let the silence stretch out, allowing Brenda's unhinged, echoing voice to hang in the air, making her look entirely erratic. Meredith stepped forward, clearly annoyed that Brenda's theatrics were stealing her spotlight. She placed a manicured hand on Brenda's shoulder, adopting the posture of a wealthy, magnanimous executive dealing with a peasant. "Leave it alone," Brenda, Meredith said, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "She is not worth our energy. We have a wedding to plan, and frankly, we are in a completely different tax bracket now. She cannot touch us." Meredith looked me up and down, her eyes full of venom and unearned superiority. She reached into her alligator skin bag and pulled out a heavy, matte black metal credit card. It was the Vanguard Tech corporate executive card, the exact account Elijah had shown me, the one they were using to embezzle millions and fund their lavish lifestyle. She held it up, making sure the light caught the embossed silver letters. "You see this?" Caroline, Meredith sneered, waving the card inches from my face. "Bradley and I are closing the biggest deal in corporate history tomorrow. Vanguard Tech is finalizing a massive merger with an anonymous international defense contractor. When the ink dries, my shares are going to skyrocket. Bradley and I are going to be billionaires. We are buying a villa in Monaco for our honeymoon while you are counting pennies to buy baby formula." I stared at the black card. Meredith was entirely clueless. She thought a mysterious, wealthy conglomerate was swooping in to buy Vanguard Tech and make her rich. She had absolutely no idea that the anonymous defense contractor executing the hostile takeover was Aegis Global. She did not realize that by signing that simple waiver in the mediation office, Bradley had legally forfeited any right to the empire I had built. I was not just buying their company. I was systematically freezing every single corrupted asset they thought they possessed. "Congratulations on the merger," I said, my voice eerily calm, my face a mask of polite indifference. "I hear corporate acquisitions can be incredibly unpredictable." Meredith scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "You would not know the first thing about corporate acquisitions. Now get out of our way before I have the manager escort you off the premises." She violently shoved her cart past mine, clipping the wheel as she marched toward the VIP checkout lanes. Brenda followed closely behind, shooting me one last look of absolute triumph. I took a slow, tactical breath, giving them a 30-second head start before leisurely pushing my own cart toward the registers. I chose the lane directly adjacent to theirs. I stood quietly arranging my baby formula on the conveyor belt, watching as the cashier began scanning Meredith and Brenda's extravagant haul. They were sparing absolutely no expense. The cashier scanned pounds of imported Wagyu beef, several jars of beluga caviar artisan truffles, and 3 cases of vintage Bollinger champagne. It was a grotesque display of stolen wealth, clearly purchased for an upscale wedding tasting. "That will be $842.16, the cashier stated politely, bagging the expensive champagne. Meredith smiled her most predatory smile. She looked over her shoulder, making direct eye contact with me, to ensure I was watching her display of infinite wealth. She tapped the heavy, matte black Vanguard Tech corporate card against the sleek digital payment terminal with a sharp, arrogant click. "Put it on the black card," she commanded. The cashier swiped the heavy metal card through the machine. The terminal processed the data for a fraction of a second. Then a harsh, discordant beep echoed through the quiet checkout lane. The screen flashed bright red. The cashier frowned, looking at the monitor in confusion. She tried swiping the card a second time. The machine emitted the same angry, rejecting beep. "I am sorry, ma'am," the cashier said, her polite customer service voice faltering as she looked up at Meredith. "The screen says the transaction is declined. There is a total freeze on this account with an active federal fraud alert." Meredith snatched the heavy metal card back from the cashier, as if the payment terminal had physically burned her. The flush of humiliation started at her chest and crept rapidly up her neck, turning her flawless complexion a mottled, angry red. "Swipe it again," Meredith demanded, her voice losing its polished aristocratic sheen and pitching into a shrill shriek. "Your machine is obviously broken. Do you have any idea who I am? That is a corporate black card. It does not get declined." The cashier, a young woman in a green apron who looked thoroughly exhausted by the display, did not reach for the card. She pointed to the bold red letters flashing across her monitor. "I cannot swipe it again, ma'am," the cashier said, her tone flat and completely unimpressed. "The system literally locked the account. It says federal fraud alert. Confiscate card. I am supposed to keep it, but honestly, I do not want to touch it again. You need to step aside." Brenda, who just minutes ago had been eagerly projecting her voice to alert the entire store to my presence, suddenly seemed very interested in inspecting the nutritional label on a jar of organic capers. The wealthy shoppers in the adjacent lanes, who had previously been glaring at my worn beige sweater, were now openly staring at Meredith. In the affluent circles of Boston, making a scene over a declined card was the ultimate social sin. "I am not stepping aside," Meredith screamed, slamming her alligator skin handbag onto the conveyor belt. She yanked her phone from her pocket, nearly dropping it in her frantic haste. "I am calling Bradley. I am calling the bank. Someone is getting fired for this. Vanguard Tech is worth hundreds of millions of dollars." I watched her completely unravel. Her hands were shaking violently as she jabbed at her phone screen. She was no longer the untouchable billionaire bride. She was a woman standing in front of $800 worth of Wagyu beef and vintage champagne that she suddenly could not afford. I stepped forward, moving with silent, deliberate precision. I bypassed Meredith entirely and placed my 6 cans of premium baby formula on the edge of the belt. I reached into my canvas tote bag, bypassed my own wallet, and pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. I handed it to the cashier. "Keep the change," I said, my voice projecting calm authority, "and thank you for your patience." The cashier let out a breath she had clearly been holding, processed my transaction instantly, and handed me my receipt. I loaded the formula back into my cart. "Caroline," Meredith hissed, her phone pressed to her ear. She was glaring at me with absolute, unadulterated hatred. "Do not think this changes anything. It is a bank error, a stupid temporary glitch." I stopped pushing my cart and turned to face her. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at her with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator watching its prey bleed out. "A federal fraud alert is never a glitch, Meredith," I said softly, ensuring only she and Brenda could hear me. "It is a consequence. Have a wonderful wedding." I turned my back on her and walked out the automatic doors, leaving her screaming at a bank representative who would not be able to help her. The crisp winter air hit my face, a refreshing contrast to the stifling tension of the grocery store. I pushed my cart toward the far end of the parking lot, away from the civilian vehicles. A heavily armored, pitch-black SUV was idling near the loading dock. As I approached, the driver's side door opened. Marcus, my head of personal security and a former Special Forces operative I had served with, stepped out. He did not say a word. He simply took the cart from my hands, loaded the formula into the secure trunk, and opened the rear passenger door for me. I climbed into the cavernous, soundproof interior of the SUV. The heavy doors shut, with a solid, airtight thud, instantly silencing the noise of the city outside. I sank into the plush leather seat and let out a long, slow breath. The facade of the broken, destitute ex-wife melted away, replaced entirely by the tactical mindset of a chief executive officer orchestrating a hostile takeover. Before Marcus even pulled the SUV out of the parking lot, the encrypted satellite phone secured in the center console began to vibrate. I picked it up and tapped the screen to accept the secure connection. "Report?" I said, skipping all pleasantries. Elias, my chief operating officer at Aegis Global, spoke with his usual rapid-fire efficiency. "The freeze was executed flawlessly, Caroline. Our financial forensic teams triggered the alert simultaneously across all of Vanguard Tech's corporate accounts. When Bradley used the corporate funds to pay for that custom Italian suit this morning, it triggered the final threshold we established with the federal regulators." "What is his current status?" I asked, watching the city streets blur past the tinted windows. "Complete panic," Elias replied. "Bradley just realized he is locked out of everything. The personal accounts, the corporate accounts, the offshore holding companies. He is currently screaming at his legal team, demanding to know why his assets are frozen. But his lawyers cannot help him. They are too busy reading the separation addendum he signed at the mediation office this morning." I felt a cold smile finally touch my lips. The imaginary business clause. Exactly. Elias confirmed, the satisfaction evident in his voice. By signing that waiver, Bradley completely surrendered any right to contest your financial maneuvers. He legally isolated himself. He thought he was throwing you out on the street, but he actually signed away his right to defend his own company from your assets. What is the status of the acquisition? I asked, needing the final confirmation. The board members at Vanguard were already terrified by the sudden federal audit, Elias explained. When they realized their CEO was under investigation for mass embezzlement, they panicked. They wanted an immediate buyout to save their own pensions. They did not care who was buying, they just wanted out. I leaned back against the leather headrest, the tension finally leaving my shoulders. Give me the final numbers, Elias. Elias took a sharp breath, clearly relishing the moment. Caroline, the shell companies have done their job. We just acquired 51% of Vanguard Tech's voting shares. You are officially Meredith and Bradley's boss. 30 days had passed since the grocery store incident. I sat in the back of my armored SUV parked discreetly in the shadows across from my former Beacon Hill mansion. The historic property was ablaze with light, projecting an aura of invincibility into the cold night air. Valets in crisp white shirts sprinted down the circular driveway, hastily parking a parade of imported sports cars and luxury sedans. Bradley and Meredith were throwing a lavish combination housewarming and engagement party. It was a grotesque display of unearned wealth, funded entirely by a man who possessed no actual capital. Elias sat beside me in the dim cabin of the SUV, his fingers dancing across the screen of an encrypted tablet. He had easily bypassed the mansion's smart home security system. Bradley, blinded by his own arrogance, was far too lazy to change the default administrative passwords I had personally coded 3 years ago. The high-definition video feed displayed the grand foyer packed shoulder to shoulder with Boston socialites and Vanguard Tech executives. Waiters in tailored vests carried silver trays, overflowing with vintage champagne and imported caviar. He really went all out for this performance. Elias noted, his voice laced with professional disgust. Our financial forensics team confirmed he took out a massive high-interest bridge loan against the remaining equity of the house to fund this party and purchase that engagement ring. He still believes the frozen corporate accounts are just a temporary bureaucratic hold related to the upcoming merger. I kept my eyes fixed on the tablet screen. Bradley was a spectacular fool. He truly thought his company was merging with a faceless international defense contractor. He had absolutely no idea that Aegis Global, my company, was the hidden entity that had quietly swallowed 51% of Vanguard Tech's voting shares. He was throwing a party with money he did not have to celebrate a corporate victory that did not exist. The audio feed crackled to life, drawing my attention back to the screen. Bradley stood halfway up the grand spiral staircase, physically elevating himself above his guests to command the room. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, piercing rings effectively silenced the murmuring crowd below. Meredith stood proudly beside him, wearing a plunging silk gown that likely cost more than an average citizen's annual salary. She clung tightly to his arm, projecting the perfect image of a triumphant society hostess. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, Bradley announced, his voice booming with arrogant confidence. We are here to celebrate 2 monumental milestones. First, my engagement to my beautiful Meredith. She has brought light luxury and true elegance back into my life. The crowd offered a round of polite, synchronized applause. Meredith preened under the attention, lifting her hand to flash a diamond ring that caught and fractured the light from the antique chandelier overhead. Secondly, we are celebrating the future, Bradley continued, his chest puffing out. As many of you know, Vanguard Tech is currently finalizing a historic corporate merger. We are partnering with a major international defense contractor, a deal that will elevate our company to the stratosphere and make all of our loyal investors incredibly wealthy. He paused dramatically, taking a slow, theatrical sip of champagne. His eyes swept across the opulent room, taking in the imported marble statues, the velvet drapes, and the excessive floral arrangements that choked the entryways. It feels incredible to finally breathe freely in this magnificent space, Bradley declared, his tone shifting from celebratory to cruel and mocking. You have no idea what it took to get this property ready for tonight. It took me years to scrub the military grime out of this house and fill it with real class." Laughter rippled through the crowd of sycophants. They chuckled at his cruelty, eager to validate the man they believed was about to make them rich. Bradley leaned into the joke, soaking up their validation. "My ex-wife treated this beautiful historic home like a military barracks. She ran her life on a rigid, joyless schedule, contributing absolutely nothing to our lifestyle or to our society. She was a heavy anchor dragging me down into mediocrity. But look at us now. The anchor is cut, the house is purified, and we are stepping into a billion-dollar future." I sat perfectly still in the dark SUV, my expression an unreadable mask. He genuinely believed his own fictional narrative. He believed he was the sole architect of his success, completely unaware that I had laid every brick of his foundation and that I was currently pulling the structural pins out one by one. Aegis Global had not just acquired Vanguard Tech. Through a secondary shell company, we had also purchased the predatory bridge loan Bradley had signed against the mansion. When he defaulted on his first payment 48 hours ago due to his frozen bank accounts, a hidden clause triggered an immediate forfeiture of the asset. I glanced at the digital clock glowing on the dashboard. It was precisely 8 o'clock. I turned to Elias and gave a single sharp nod. "Execute the final phase." Elias tapped a key on his secured laptop. Across the street, the heavy oak front doors of the Beacon Hill mansion loomed under the amber glow of the porch lights. Through the audio feed on the tablet, the sharp, authoritative ringing of the doorbell cut clearly through the classical music and the wealthy chatter. Meredith laughed, a shrill, grating sound that spiked the audio meters on my screen. "Oh, that must be the caterers with the second round of beluga caviar," she announced loudly to the executive standing nearby. She patted Bradley affectionately on the chest. "Go, let them in, darling. Tell them to take it straight to the dining room." Bradley handed his empty champagne flute to a passing waiter. He adjusted the pristine cuffs of his tailored suit, squared his shoulders, and strode confidently toward the foyer. The security camera feed tracked his movement as he grasped the polished brass handle and pulled the heavy door open with a wide, welcoming smile. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of utter confusion. Standing on the front porch was not a catering team holding silver trays of luxury appetizers. It was a uniformed county sheriff, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Flanking the sheriff was a tall, sharp-featured woman in a tailored charcoal suit holding a thick leather portfolio. She was Aegis Global's top real estate asset manager. Bradley froze in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass handle. The classical string music playing softly in the background suddenly sounded completely absurd against the harsh reality standing on his doorstep. The guests nearest the foyer stopped talking, sensing the sudden sharp shift in the atmosphere. "Mr. Bradley," the sheriff stated, his deep voice loud enough to carry into the suddenly silent foyer, "we are not here for the party." The asset manager stepped forward, her face a mask of cold corporate efficiency. She opened the leather portfolio and held up a federal court order stamped with a bright red seal. "You are trespassing on private corporate property," she said, her voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy perfumed air of the mansion. "This estate is now legally owned by Aegis Global. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises." Bradley snatched the heavy watermarked document from the sheriff. The crisp sound of the paper tearing slightly at the edge echoed in the dead, silent foyer. Every guest within earshot had stopped breathing, their champagne flutes frozen mid-air. Bradley scanned the dense legal text, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. "This is a joke," Bradley spat, shoving the paper back at the sheriff. "A pathetic administrative error. I am Bradley Vance. I am the CEO of Vanguard Tech. I pay the mortgage on this house every single month. This is my property." The sheriff did not flinch. He did not take the paper back. He simply rested his hand on his utility belt. "The document is certified by the federal court, Mr. Vance. You are currently trespassing. I suggest you tell your guests to locate their coats." "I am not telling my guests anything," Bradley roared, his voice cracking with rising panic. He turned his furious gaze to the sharp-featured woman in the charcoal suit. "Who the hell are you? Who do you work for? I will have your job for this." The asset manager offered a smile so devoid of warmth it could have frozen the harbor. My name is Ms. Sterling. I represent Apex Holdings. And you do not pay the mortgage, Mr. Vance. In fact, you have not made a single payment in over 90 days. Meredith pushed her way to Bradley's side, her silk gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She glared at Ms. Sterling, her diamond engagement ring catching the harsh porch light as she crossed her arms aggressively. That is an absolute lie. Bradley is a billionaire. We have millions in liquid assets. He just bought me this custom 5-carat diamond for our engagement. Miss Sterling looked directly at the ring, her expression utterly unimpressed by the glittering stone. Yes, we are fully aware of the ring, Meredith. Our financial forensic team tracked the wire transfers. The funds that were legally designated for the property escrow account were diverted to a private jeweler in Antwerp. You are wearing the delinquent mortgage payments on your left hand. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of executives and socialites pressing into the foyer. The whispers began instantly. The people who had been praising Meredith's taste 5 minutes ago were now openly dissecting her financial ruin. They whispered about the rented furniture, the unpaid caterers, and the fake billionaire facade. Bradley ripped his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking violently as he scrolled through his contacts. I am calling the bank. I am calling my wealth manager. I will wire the entire remaining balance of the mortgage right now, and then I am suing your firm into oblivion. You cannot wire anything, Ms. Sterling stated, her voice slicing cleanly through his frantic blustering. Your personal and corporate accounts are frozen under a massive federal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. You have zero liquidity. Your mortgage was legally bought out by Apex Holdings 3 years ago. You defaulted yesterday. The foreclosure is absolute and final. Bradley stared at his phone screen. The red error messages from earlier that day at the grocery store were still there, glaring back at him. The reality was finally crashing through his monumental arrogance. He was entirely broke. The illusion was dead. Meredith grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Bradley, do something. Write them a check. Call your investors. We have a housewarming party happening right now. There is no party, the sheriff announced, stepping fully into the foyer and signaling to 3 deputies waiting on the porch. Everyone needs to clear the residence immediately. Move toward the exits. The event is over. Panic erupted among the elite guests. They did not want to be associated with a federal fraud investigation or caught in the middle of a humiliating public eviction. The socialites began pushing toward the coat check, abandoning their half-empty crystal flutes on priceless antique tables. They practically trampled each other to get to the side doors. Bradley stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, watching his guests flee. Apex Holdings. He muttered, his eyes wide and unfocused. Who owns Apex Holdings? I will buy them out. I will negotiate directly with the owner. Ms. Sterling stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. She leaned in, ensuring her voice carried just enough for Bradley, Meredith, and the closest lingering guests to hear. Apex Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of Aegis Global, Ms. Sterling said, delivering the final fatal blow. Caroline Vance is the sole proprietor and CEO. She owns the debt. She owns the equity. She owns this house, and she wants you off her property. Meredith let out a high-pitched shriek, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. Caroline, that mousy, pathetic soldier, no. No, that is impossible. She left here with nothing. She left here with the strategic advantage, Ms. Sterling corrected coldly. Deputies escort them out. 2 large sheriff deputies flanked Bradley and Meredith. They did not ask politely. They grabbed Bradley by the arms, completely ignoring his protests and his tailored suit, and propelled him toward the open front doors. Meredith screamed, fighting against the deputy who guided her outward, her expensive silk gown tangling awkwardly around her legs. I need my things, Meredith shrieked, tears of pure rage ruining her carefully applied designer makeup. My jewelry, my clothes, my bags are upstairs. All personal property left in the residence is currently impounded pending the federal audit of Mr. Vance's embezzled funds, Ms. Sterling called out after them. If you can prove you purchased them with clean money, you may file a petition in court. Have a good evening. They were shoved violently out onto the front porch. The heavy oak doors were pulled shut behind them, cutting off the warmth and the brilliant light of the mansion they had falsely claimed as their kingdom. The heavy deadbolts clicked loudly into place. As if on cue, the Boston sky cracked open. A freezing torrential downpour began to assault the city. The icy rain instantly soaked through Bradley's custom suit, plastering his carefully styled hair to his forehead. Meredith shivered violently, her bare arms and thin silk gown offering zero protection against the bitter, biting cold. Her elaborate hairstyle collapsed into wet, stringy strands against her pale face. They stumbled down the front steps, forced to stand on the wet, flooded sidewalk. Behind them, the guests they had so desperately wanted to impress were pouring out of the side doors, rushing to their valeted cars. The socialites did not offer rides. They did not offer umbrellas. Instead, they raised their smartphones. The blinding flashes of phone cameras illuminated the dark, rain-slicked street. Bradley's elite peers were recording every agonizing second of his absolute destruction, broadcasting his and Meredith's pathetic eviction to the entire city. A white commercial van pulled up sharply to the curb, splashing freezing puddle water onto Meredith's ruined designer heels. The side of the van read Boston Elite Locksmiths in bold black letters. Two men in heavy work jackets jumped out holding power drills and heavy metal hardware. They jogged right past Bradley and Meredith, heading straight for the front doors. Bradley stood in the pouring rain, watching helplessly as the locksmiths began drilling the brass locks out of the heavy oak doors. The high-pitched whine of the drills echoed down the affluent street, cutting through the sound of the rain. The house he had leveraged his entire non-existent empire to keep was being permanently sealed against him. He had no money, nowhere to hide, and an audience of his peers eagerly documenting his ultimate ruin. The freezing Boston rain had dried into a stiff, humiliating crust on Bradley's custom Italian suit. He had spent the entire night parked in a desolate alleyway inside his leased sports car, listening to Meredith scream until her voice went hoarse. She had cursed him, slapped the dashboard, and finally demanded he call his parents for a bailout. His parents had sent him straight to voicemail. By dawn, the reality of his situation had settled into his bones like a physical ache. His corporate black cards were confiscated. His personal banking apps displayed terrifying red zeros and fraud alert locks. He had exactly $14 in his wallet. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately before the repo men tracked down his car. Desperation breeds delusion. Bradley pulled up an old family tracking application on his phone, a remnant from when he used to monitor the twins' tablet usage. The location beacon pinged steadily at the Grand Continental, one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in the city. A cruel, arrogant smirk broke through his shivering facade. Caroline had to be working there. He knew she had zero corporate experience and a useless military background. In his mind, it made perfect sense that she had taken a job scrubbing toilets and changing sheets to make ends meet after he kicked her out. She was weak, predictable, and desperate for stability. He could use that. Bradley left Meredith sleeping fitfully in the passenger seat and marched into the opulent gilded lobby of the Grand Continental. His shoes squeaked embarrassingly against the imported marble. He bypassed the concierge desk, entirely slipping into a private elevator right behind a wealthy businessman and pressing the button for the top floor. He assumed Caroline would be up there hiding in a supply closet or stealing a break in an empty suite. The heavy elevator doors slid open, revealing the ultra-exclusive VIP lounge. The space was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the Boston skyline. Bradley stepped out his wrinkled, water-stained suit, standing out starkly against the velvet furnishings and crystal chandeliers. He spotted her immediately. Caroline was sitting at a private corner table overlooking the harbor. She was not pushing a housekeeping cart. She was not wearing a polyester uniform. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal blazer, her posture immaculate. A silver pot of fresh espresso sat on the table next to a leather-bound tablet. Bradley's ego instantly short-circuited his logic. His brain refused to process the reality in front of him. He convinced himself she had simply snuck into the lounge to rest before her shift manager found her. He smoothed down his ruined lapels, pasted on the remorseful, charming smile that used to win every argument during their marriage, and confidently crossed the room. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking for permission. He reached over casually, taking a fresh almond pastry from a silver tray on her table and taking a bite. Caroline did not flinch. She did not look surprised. She simply rested her porcelain cup on its saucer and watched him with a gaze so intensely calm it made his skin crawl. "You look terrible, Bradley," Caroline stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "It has been a rough night." Bradley sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table to play the victim. He pitched his voice into a low, intimate register, attempting to manufacture a connection that had been dead for years. "I am going to be completely honest with you, Caroline. I made a mistake, a massive mistake." Caroline tilted her head slightly, waiting. "It is Meredith," Bradley continued, shaking his head with manufactured exhaustion. "She is entirely out of control. The woman is obsessed with money. She drained my accounts to buy imported marble and conflict diamonds. She is crazy, Caroline. I spent the whole night trapped in a car with her, and all I could think about was how much I missed our quiet life. I miss the stability. I miss the twins." He reached his hand across the table, attempting to cover hers. Caroline smoothly moved her hand away, picking up her espresso cup. Bradley swallowed his irritation and pressed forward, his desperation leaking through the charm. "There is a temporary hold on my corporate accounts. Just a bureaucratic banking error because of a big merger I am handling. It will be cleared up by Monday. But right now Meredith is driving me insane and I need a place to stay." He offered his most pathetic, pleading look. "Caroline, Meredith is crazy. I miss the twins. Just let me borrow your VIA disability check to get a hotel." Caroline did not laugh. She did not raise her voice. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her espresso, her dark eyes locking onto his panicked face. The silence in the VIP lounge stretched out heavy and suffocating. "I do not have a VA check, Bradley," Caroline said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Before Bradley could process her words, the soft chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the lounge. The brushed steel doors slid open. Elijah Aegis Global's lead forensic accountant stepped out onto the plush carpet. He was flanked by two men wearing dark windbreakers with federal badges clipped to their belts. Elijah held a massive, heavily bound financial ledger in his hands. Elijah walked directly to their table, his eyes locked onto Bradley with absolute predatory focus. He dropped the heavy ledger onto the table with a loud final thud that made Bradley jump in his seat. "But you have a federal indictment," Elijah said. Bradley stared at the massive leather-bound ledger as if it were a live explosive. The charming, remorseful mask he had carefully plastered on his face melted away, replaced by the pale, twitchy reality of a cornered animal. He looked from the heavy ledger to the two men in dark windbreakers flanking Elijah. The silver federal badges clipped to their belts caught the ambient light of the VIP lounge, reflecting a truth Bradley desperately wanted to deny. "What is this?" Bradley demanded, his voice dropping its smooth cadence and pitching upward into a defensive squeak. "Caroline, call off your attack dogs. This is a private club." Caroline did not even blink. She took another slow, deliberate sip of her espresso, her dark eyes locked on Bradley over the rim of the porcelain cup. She remained entirely silent, letting Elijah take the floor. Elijah casually unbuttoned his suit jacket and flipped the heavy cover of the ledger open. The thick parchment pages were covered in red ink, highlighted transaction numbers and stark financial summaries. He did not look at Bradley with anger. He looked at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a parasite. "This," Elijah stated, tapping a manicured finger against a densely populated spreadsheet, "is a complete forensic reconstruction of your corporate and personal finances over the past 36 months. It turns out that when a federal judge freezes your accounts, people start to look very closely at why the water was leaking in the first place." "There are no leaks," Bradley spat, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms in a desperate show of defiance. Vanguard Tech is in the middle of a massive international merger. My accounts are on a standard compliance hold. My attorneys will have your credentials revoked for harassment by Monday morning. Your attorneys quit at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Elijah corrected smoothly. They submitted their formal withdrawal of representation the moment we provided them with page 42 of this document. It seems they were entirely unaware that their exorbitant retainer was being paid with stolen corporate funds. Bradley flinched. His eyes darted toward the private elevator, calculating the distance, but the federal agents subtly shifted their weight, blocking any potential exit path. Let us review the highlights. Elijah continued, turning a page with a sharp, crisp rustle. Starting with the wire fraud. 8 months ago, Vanguard Tech secured a Series C funding round intended for server expansion and hardware upgrades. Exactly 48 hours after the capital hit the corporate accounts, you authorized a transfer of $2.4 million to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. That was a legitimate vendor contract, Bradley countered quickly. Sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning of the lounge. We were outsourcing proprietary code development. You were outsourcing your lifestyle. Elijah shot back, his voice dropping into a hard, unforgiving tone. We pierced the corporate veil on that shell company yesterday morning. The sole beneficiary of that account is your fiancée, Meredith. She used those corporate funds to purchase the conflict diamonds currently sitting on her left hand, import custom Italian marble for a house you no longer own, and fund a string of luxury vacations under the guise of corporate scouting trips. That constitutes corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and international money laundering. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but Elijah simply turned another page, refusing to give him an inch of breathing room. Then we have the bridge loan, Elijah said, tapping a brightly highlighted section. You leveraged the remaining equity of the Beacon Hill mansion to secure a short-term, high-interest personal loan to fund tonight's party. But you falsified your asset declarations to the lender. You claimed full ownership of Vanguard Tech patents that were actually collateralized in a previous undisclosed settlement. That is bank fraud, Bradley. It is a major federal offense. The silence in the lounge was absolute. The soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers felt entirely disconnected from the total destruction happening at the corner table. Bradley stared at the open ledger, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. The illusion of his brilliance, his wealth, and his untouchable status had been mathematically dismantled and bound in leather. When a cornered animal realizes it has no escape, it always attacks. Bradley surged to his feet, knocking his chair backward. It hit the floor with a loud crack. He slammed his hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward Elijah. The progressive, sophisticated tech billionaire facade shattered entirely, revealing the elitist, arrogant bully he had always been. You think you have me figured out? Bradley sneered, his face mere inches from Elijah's. You are nothing but a glorified accountant. A pathetic, miserable number cruncher my sister married out of sheer pity because no one else would tolerate you. You grew up in a trailer park, Elijah. You wear cheap suits and you drive a minivan. You do not belong in this room, you do not belong in my family, and you absolutely cannot touch me. I am Bradley Vance. I built an empire. Caroline finally set her espresso cup down. The delicate clink of porcelain against the saucer cut through Bradley's rant like a gunshot. You built a house of cards, Caroline said quietly, and you used my money to buy the deck. Elijah did not flinch at Bradley's vicious insults. He did not raise his voice or defend his marriage to Bradley's sister. He simply looked at the furious, sweating man in front of him and offered a smile so cold it dropped the temperature in the room. He closed the heavy ledger with a decisive, echoing snap. You are right about one thing, Bradley, Elijah said, his voice entirely composed. I am just an accountant. I do not have the authority to touch you. Bradley let out a harsh, barking laugh of triumph, pointing a shaking finger at Elijah. Exactly. You are a paper pusher. You have no power here. You take this fake ledger and you get out of my sight before I call hotel security. I do not need to touch you, Elijah continued, ignoring the interruption completely. He picked up the ledger and handed it directly to the federal agent standing to his left. Because I do not execute the warrants, I just do the math. And earlier this morning I handed the complete verified audit over to Vanguard Tech's new majority shareholder. Bradley's triumphant sneer froze on his face. His hand dropped slowly to his side. "What are you talking about? Vanguard is merging with an international defense contractor. We are finalizing the equity split on Tuesday." "There is no merger," Elijah stated, his tone flat and absolute. "There never was a merger, Bradley. Aegis Global set up the dummy corporation to blindside your board of directors. While you were busy stealing from your own company to buy Meredith diamond necklaces, Aegis Global was quietly buying up every single scrap of your debt and purchasing 51% of your voting shares." Bradley stumbled backward, his legs hitting the overturned chair. He looked from Elijah to the federal agents and finally to Caroline, who sat perfectly still, radiating absolute authority. "You are not merging, Bradley," Elijah said, delivering the final fatal blow. "You are the target of a hostile takeover. You no longer own your company, you no longer own your house, and as of this morning, you no longer own your freedom." 72 hours after the hostile takeover of Vanguard Tech went public, the Boston financial district was buzzing with rumors, but Meredith was not going to let the narrative slip from her manicured fingers. The frozen bank accounts, the eviction, and the sheer humiliation of being tossed onto the street had initially sent her into a hysterical spiral, but Meredith was a survivor of the highest social order. When the truth did not serve her, she simply manufactured a new one. She secured a prime guest slot on the city's most popular financial podcast, The Boston Ledger. Sitting in the soundproof studio wearing a pristine white cashmere sweater designed to project innocence and vulnerability, Meredith leaned into the microphone. Her eyes were perfectly glossy, holding back tears that she had spent the entire morning practicing in the mirror. "It is a nightmare, David," Meredith said, her voice trembling with expertly calibrated distress as she addressed the host. "Bradley is a visionary. He built Vanguard Tech from nothing, pouring his soul into developing technology that actually helps people. But we are being terrorized by a corporate bully who is using limitless illicit funding to run a personal vendetta against us." The host leaned forward, captivated by the drama. "You are referring to the CEO of Aegis Global, Caroline Vance, Bradley's ex-wife." "She is not a CEO, David," Meredith scoffed softly, shaking her head as a single tear escaped down her cheek. "She is a deranged, jealous ex-wife who could not handle the fact that Bradley outgrew her. Caroline was always unstable. She treated their marriage like a military deployment, cold, rigid, and completely devoid of warmth. When Bradley finally found happiness with me, something inside her snapped. This entire hostile takeover is not business. It is stalking. She is stalking my fiancé, destroying his life's work and threatening my safety out of sheer unhinged spite." Meredith took a delicate sip of water, letting her accusations hang heavy in the digital airspace. She painted a vivid, horrific picture of a bitter veteran utilizing shadowy defense contracting money to ruin an innocent tech genius. She conveniently omitted the wire fraud, the forged mortgage documents, and the millions of dollars of embezzled corporate funds sitting in her own jewelry boxes. To the thousands of listeners tuning in, Meredith was the tragic heroine, and Caroline was a monster. The podcast broadcasted at dawn. By noon, the manufactured outrage had successfully mobilized the one person in Boston who hated Caroline more than Meredith did. Brenda Vance, Bradley's mother, had spent the last decade making her disdain for Caroline explicitly clear. Brenda was a woman who valued country club memberships, high society pedigree, and submissive daughters-in-law. She had always viewed Caroline's military service as brutally unladylike, and her working-class background as a permanent stain on the Vance family tree. Hearing Meredith's tearful podcast interview was the ultimate validation of Brenda's prejudice. Furious that her golden boy was being humiliated, Brenda rallied her affluent suburban church group. They were a terrifying squadron of wealthy, entitled women who operated under the guise of moral superiority. Armed with hastily made poster boards and an aggressive sense of self-righteousness, the group descended upon the Grand Continental Hotel. Brenda had convinced herself that Caroline was staying at the hotel using her ill-gotten gains to live in luxury while Bradley suffered. The reality was that Brenda had no idea where Caroline actually lived or worked, but the Grand Continental made for a highly visible stage. The protest was a spectacle of suburban outrage. Women in designer trench coats and pearl necklaces marched in a tight circle on the sidewalk, blocking the hotel's main entrance. Brenda stood at the center, gripping a battery-powered megaphone with white-knuckled intensity. Caroline Vance is a predator. Brenda's voice blared through the megaphone, echoing off the glass facades of the financial district. She is a corporate bully and an unfit mother. She is terrorizing an innocent family. Stop the harassment. Save the twins from this deranged woman. The women behind her hoisted their signs higher. They read, "Protect Boston Business" and "Stop the Stalker." Pedestrians slowed down to watch the bizarre display. Tourists snapped photos of the wealthy women screaming on the sidewalk. Hotel security stood by helplessly, unable to physically remove the protesters from public property. Brenda was in her element, weaponizing her maternal outrage to defend a son who had actively stolen millions of dollars from his own investors. 10 miles away, high above the chaos of the city streets, Caroline sat in the executive boardroom of Aegis Global headquarters. The room was a fortress of soundproof glass and dark mahogany. A massive digital monitor covered the entire far wall, currently displaying a split screen. On the left was the audio waveform of Meredith's podcast interview. On the right was a live helicopter news feed of Brenda and her church group marching outside the Grand Continental. Marcus, the fiercely protective director of public relations for Aegis Global, paced the length of the boardroom. He was vibrating with professional rage. He slapped a thick legal dossier onto the polished wood table in front of Caroline. "This is textbook defamation, Caroline," Marcus stated, his voice sharp and urgent. "Meredith went on a syndicated platform and explicitly accused you of stalking and harassment. Your former mother-in-law is currently slandering your fitness as a parent on live television. We have an army of litigators on retainer. Give me the green light. I will file a massive defamation lawsuit right now. We will bury Meredith in legal fees by sundown and have a gag order placed on Brenda before she finishes her next chant." Caroline did not look at the legal dossier. She kept her eyes focused on the massive monitor, watching her former mother-in-law scream into a megaphone. Her expression remained entirely calm, completely devoid of the panic or anger that Meredith and Brenda were so desperately trying to provoke. She recognized their behavior for exactly what it was: the frantic, uncoordinated flailing of an enemy whose supply lines had been entirely cut. She picked up her porcelain cup and took a slow, methodical sip of her espresso. "No," Caroline said softly, setting the cup down with a quiet click. "We are not suing them." Marcus stopped pacing, staring at her in disbelief. "Caroline, they are assassinating your character on a massive scale. If we do not respond, the public will think Meredith is telling the truth." "Let them dig the grave deeper," Caroline commanded, her voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling authority. "When an adversary is actively sabotaging their own credibility, you do not interrupt them. You give them a bigger platform." She turned away from the monitor and looked directly at Marcus. "Draft an official embossed invitation. Send it directly to Meredith by bonded courier this afternoon," Caroline instructed. "Invite her as the guest of honor to the Aegis Global Corporate Merger Gala this Friday night." Marcus blinked, his legal mind racing to catch up with her tactical precision. "You want to invite the woman calling you a deranged stalker to our biggest corporate event of the decade. I want her to wear her stolen diamonds and stand in a room full of the city's most powerful investors," Caroline replied, a cold, calculated smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. "Let's finish this." The heavy rhythmic pounding on Brenda Vance's mahogany front door made Bradley flinch. He was slouched on his mother's floral sofa, wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt he had been living in for 3 days. Beside him, Meredith was furiously scrolling through social media analytics on her phone, tracking the engagement of her podcast interview. Brenda marched to the entryway and yanked the door open, prepared to unleash a barrage of suburban fury on whoever was interrupting her afternoon. Instead, she found a bonded courier standing on her welcome mat holding a silver tray. Resting on the velvet lining was a thick, matte black envelope sealed with a silver wax stamp. Brenda snatched the envelope, slammed the door in the courier's face without a word of thanks, and carried the heavy parchment into the living room. "What is that?" Meredith demanded, her head snapping up from her screen. Brenda broke the wax seal, sliding out a piece of heavy, silver-edged cardstock. Her eyes scanned the elegant embossed typography. A slow, deeply arrogant smile spread across her face. She handed the card to Bradley. Bradley read the words aloud, his voice trembling before gaining a sudden, desperate strength. Aegis Global Corporate Merger Gala, the Ritz-Carlton Ballroom, Friday, 8 o'clock in the evening. You are cordially invited as our VIP guests of honor. Meredith practically leaped off the sofa, ripping the invitation from Bradley's hands to read it herself. She traced the raised silver lettering with a manicured fingernail, letting out a sharp, breathless laugh of total triumph. "I told you," Meredith gasped, her eyes wide with a manic, delusional energy. "I told you my podcast would work. I told you that protest would force their hand." "Force whose hand?" Bradley asked, blinking rapidly as his shattered ego desperately tried to reassemble itself. Caroline initiated the hostile takeover. Elijah delivered the audit. "Bradley, use your brain," Meredith snapped, waving the heavy cardstock in his face. Caroline is an unhinged emotional wreck. She hijacked Aegis Global's resources for a personal vendetta, but Aegis Global has a board of directors. They have real investors. You do not think a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor wants a PR nightmare, do you? They saw the public backlash. They saw your mother on the news. The real leadership of Aegis Global is stepping in. Brenda clapped her hands together, entirely subscribing to the fantasy. Meredith is exactly right. That little military tramp overplayed her hand. The real executives at Aegis are embarrassed by her behavior. They're inviting you as the VIPs to apologize. They are going to finalize the Vanguard merger on your terms, Bradley. And they are going to fire that pathetic accountant Elijah and throw Caroline out onto the street where she belongs. The delusion acted like a narcotic. Within seconds, the three of them had constructed an entirely fictitious reality where they were the ultimate victors. The frozen bank accounts, the federal indictments, and the eviction notices were suddenly just temporary inconveniences. "We need to look the part," Meredith declared, her eyes narrowing as she mentally inventoried her wardrobe. "If we are walking into the Ritz-Carlton to sign a multi-million-dollar merger, we cannot look like victims. We have to project absolute dominance." That afternoon, the reality of their financial ruin collided violently with their desperate need to maintain appearances. Meredith marched into the most exclusive designer boutique on Newbury Street, selecting a breathtaking backless crimson silk gown. She handed her platinum credit card to the sales associate with a practiced, dismissive flick of her wrist. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. "Declined." Meredith's face burned as the sales associate offered a thinly veiled look of pity. She snatched the card back, claiming a banking error, and tried 3 more cards. Every single one was locked by federal freeze. Brenda, seething with humiliation at the checkout counter, finally pulled out her own emergency credit card, a card reserved for severe home repairs. She swiped it aggressively, draining her remaining available credit to cover the $4,000 gown. Bradley fared no better. With his corporate accounts seized, he was forced to visit a high-volume rental shop. He spent an hour berating a teenage employee over the quality of the wool blend, ultimately spending the last $300 of his hidden emergency cash on a rented tuxedo that pinched slightly at the shoulders. By Friday evening, they had exhausted absolutely every resource they possessed to fund a single night of manufactured glamour. A standard economy rideshare pulled up to the glittering entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. Meredith stepped out onto the curb, her crimson silk gown catching the flash of the venue's exterior lighting. She immediately snapped at the driver for stopping too far from the red carpet, refusing to leave a tip. Bradley followed, tugging uncomfortably at his rented collar, while Brenda adjusted her heavy, outdated pearl necklace. They approached the grand ballroom entrance, operating on pure toxic entitlement. The lobby was swarming with Boston's financial elite, wealthy investors, and corporate titans. "Name," the hostess asked politely, holding a digital tablet at the velvet rope. "Vance," Bradley said, puffing out his chest and lifting his chin. "Bradley Vance, CEO of Vanguard Tech. We are the VIP guests of honor." The hostess tapped her screen. A highly trained, perfectly corporate smile spread across her face. "Ah, yes, Mr. Vance, we have been expecting you. Right this way." Meredith shot Brenda a triumphant, "I told you so," smirk as the velvet rope was unclipped. They strutted past the line of regular attendees, their heads held high, entirely oblivious to the trap they had just willingly walked into. They did not notice the heavy security presence lingering near the exits. They did not notice the distinct lack of Vanguard tech branding anywhere in the opulent space. They stepped into the breathtaking crystal-lit ballroom, sneering at a waiter who offered them a tray of champagne. "Do not bother with the hired help," Meredith whispered to Bradley, her eyes scanning the room for the executive table. "Let us go find the billionaire who runs this place and get your company back." Meredith led the charge, her rented crimson silk gown swishing against the polished marble floors as they navigated the crowded foyer. Bradley walked a half-step behind her, adjusting his stiff, ill-fitting tuxedo collar, while Brenda flanked them, her eyes darting hungrily across the room. They pushed past a group of high-profile venture capitalists and influential tech developers, their arrogance blinding them to the confused glances they received. In their minds, they were not bankrupted frauds facing federal indictment. They were royalty returning to claim their throne. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom had been transformed into an absolute fortress of corporate dominance. Massive ice sculptures bearing the stark, sharp crest of Aegis Global anchored the extravagant buffet stations. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated seamlessly, balancing silver trays laden with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and imported caviar. The low, sophisticated hum of wealth and power vibrated through the air. It was a room filled with the apex predators of the financial world, all gathered to celebrate the most aggressive corporate takeover of the decade. Bradley scanned the room, his ego working overtime to construct a comforting delusion. He was searching for an older man, a traditional silver-haired titan of industry. He planned to march up to this imaginary billionaire, play the victim of a rogue forensic accountant, and demand the immediate reinstatement of his corporate accounts. Meredith was equally focused, her eyes narrowed as she plotted exactly how to charm the mysterious Aegis Global CEO into keeping her on the executive board. Then Brenda stopped dead in her tracks. Her manicured hand shot out her fingers, digging into Bradley's bicep like a vice. Her face carefully painted and lifted to project suburban perfection, twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She pointed a trembling finger toward the center of the room, directly in front of the main presentation podium. There stood Caroline. She was not hiding near the service exits. She was not wearing a faded polyester uniform, and she was not pushing a housekeeping cart. Caroline was draped in a breathtaking custom-made floor-length emerald gown. The fabric clung to her athletic frame with devastating elegance, the dark green silk contrasting sharply with her composed, striking features. Subtle, perfectly cut diamonds flashed at her throat and wrists, catching the brilliant light of the chandeliers above. She looked radiant, commanding, and utterly untouchable. Caroline was not standing alone. She was deeply engaged in a serious, quiet conversation with a man Bradley instantly recognized. It was United States Senator Thomas Sterling, the most powerful political figure in Massachusetts. The senator was leaning in, nodding attentively to whatever Caroline was saying, his body language communicating absolute deference and deep respect. Bradley's brain simply refused to process the image. The cognitive dissonance was too massive. Poisoned by years of unhinged narcissism, and fueled by the desperate need to be superior, he instantly formulated a new comforting lie. He convinced himself that Caroline had manipulated her way past security, leveraging her military veteran status to corner a politician and sabotage Vanguard Tech's night of triumph out of bitter jealousy. Brenda did not hesitate. Her hatred for her former daughter-in-law overrode whatever minor shred of social decorum she possessed. She marched across the crowded ballroom floor, shoving a waiter aside and charging directly toward the podium. Bradley and Meredith followed right on her heels, emboldened by Brenda's staggering entitlement. The sophisticated hum of the gala was shattered by Brenda's shrill, penetrating voice. "Security!" Brenda shrieked, waving her arms frantically to attract the attention of the dark-suited men lining the perimeter of the ballroom. "Security who let this homeless veteran in," She is stalking my son." The sheer volume and sheer vulgarity of her screech caused heads to snap around instantly. The ambient noise of the room died a sudden brutal death. Wealthy investors, corporate executives, and international dignitaries paused mid-sentence. Champagne flutes hovered frozen in the air. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned to witness the bizarre aggressive spectacle unfolding near the stage. Caroline slowly turned her head. She did not look startled. She did not look intimidated. She simply observed Brenda with the serene, detached calm of a predator watching a severely injured animal stumble into a trap. Meredith, desperate to assert her own dominance and secure her position in front of the assembled financial elite, stepped eagerly ahead of Brenda. She placed a hand on her hip, looking Caroline up and down with manufactured, sneering pity. She pitched her voice to carry, ensuring every powerful investor in the room could hear her. "Did you sneak in to steal the hors d'oeuvres, Caroline?" Meredith laughed loudly, the sound harsh, grating, and desperately hollow in the sudden quiet of the ballroom. "Get out before I have you arrested. You are embarrassing yourself." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and entirely terrifying. It was not the silence of a crowd witnessing an embarrassing party crasher being caught. It was the silence of hundreds of highly influential, ruthlessly intelligent people watching three oblivious fools commit spectacular social and professional suicide on a public stage. Senator Sterling did not look at Caroline with pity or confusion. He slowly turned his gaze to Meredith, his eyes narrowing into a glare of profound, icy disgust. He looked at her as if she were a noxious insect that had just crawled onto his shoe. From the shadows of the room, the head of security approached. He was a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a discreet earpiece, moving with swift, purposeful strides. Bradley crossed his arms and smirked, rocking back on his heels, eagerly waiting for the massive man to grab Caroline by the arm and drag her out through the service doors. The security chief stepped right past Bradley without a single glance. He walked directly up to Caroline, stopped, and bowed his head respectfully. The heavy crystal chandeliers overhead suddenly dimmed. The heavy crystal chandeliers overhead faded to a dramatic, low ambient glow. The sudden shift in lighting completely neutralized Brenda's screeching demand for security. The massive security chief, having just bowed his head respectfully to Caroline, faded seamlessly back into the shadows of the ballroom perimeter without uttering a single word. Senator Sterling offered Caroline a warm, deferential smile, patted her arm lightly, and stepped back into the crowd, leaving her standing alone in her striking emerald gown. Bradley tugged frantically at his tight tuxedo collar, a cold sweat breaking out across his shoulder blades. His arrogant certainty began to fracture. Something was terribly wrong. The security team had ignored his mother. A United States senator had glared at his fiancée with utter revulsion. The entire room of affluent investors was watching them not with admiration, but with a mixture of profound annoyance and clinical pity. Meredith, entirely oblivious to the shifting power dynamic, leaned into Bradley and squeezed his bicep. She whispered excitedly that the presentation was starting, and the real CEO was about to make an entrance to personally welcome them to the executive board. Brenda furiously smoothed down the front of her outdated dress, lifting her chin to project a ridiculous aura of superiority, thoroughly convinced her VIP status was about to be validated. A smooth, richly amplified voice resonated through the high-fidelity sound system, commanding absolute attention from everyone in the room. A distinguished master of ceremonies stepped up to the acrylic podium at the center of the main stage. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of Boston's financial elite. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and esteemed corporate partners." The MC began, his voice echoing with practiced reverence. "Tonight marks a monumental shift in the international technological landscape. For the past 5 years, Aegis Global has operated in the shadows, quietly building a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of defense contracts, cybersecurity infrastructure, and advanced data analytics. Tonight, Aegis Global steps firmly into the light." A murmur of excitement rippled through the affluent crowd. Bradley felt his chest tighten with anticipation. The sheer scale of Aegis Global was staggering. If they were truly acquiring Vanguard tech, he expected a massive immediate payout to clear his legal troubles. He eagerly awaited his name to be called. We are gathered this evening to celebrate the most aggressive and successful corporate acquisition of the decade. The MC continued, gesturing grandly toward the center of the room. Please join me in welcoming the visionary architect behind this historic takeover. She is a decorated military veteran, a brilliant corporate strategist, the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Global, and the new absolute majority owner of Vanguard Tech. The MC raised his hand and beamed. Ms. Caroline Vance. A blinding crisp white spotlight snapped on with a sharp mechanical click. It did not sweep toward the grand staircase or the VIP double doors at the back of the hall. It dropped directly from the ceiling, plunging straight down like a lightning bolt. The brilliant circle of light illuminated Caroline. She stood perfectly still, the emerald silk of her custom gown shimmering under the intense beam. She did not look surprised. She looked like a queen who had finally ascended her throne. Bradley's brain suffered a catastrophic failure. The cognitive dissonance of hearing his ex-wife introduced as a billionaire titan of industry short-circuited his nervous system. All the blood drained from his face. The muscles in his right arm went entirely slack. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his numb fingers and hit the polished marble floor. It shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the sharp crash ringing out in the dead quiet of the ballroom. Bradley stared at Caroline, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable horrific reality crashed down upon him, crushing the last remnants of his delusion. Caroline was the anonymous buyer. Caroline was the hostile entity. Caroline was the one who deployed the forensic accountants. Caroline owned everything. Meredith stared into the center of the spotlight, her meticulously applied makeup suddenly looking like a clown mask over her sickly pale skin. Her breath caught in her throat, resulting in a pathetic, choking gasp. The arrogance that had fueled her entire existence evaporated in a microsecond. She had just spent the morning on a syndicated podcast, calling the CEO of Aegis Global a deranged stalker. She had just screamed at her in front of a United States senator. She had just demanded the owner of the hotel throw her out on the street. Meredith's knees buckled. She grabbed frantically at Bradley's rented tuxedo jacket to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor, but Bradley offered no support. He was completely paralyzed, staring blankly ahead. Brenda experienced a full systemic meltdown. The woman she had tormented, belittled, and treated as worthless working-class trash was currently standing in a spotlight commanding the respect of the most powerful people in the state. Brenda let out a strangled, wheezing cry of absolute denial. She took a blind, panicked step backward to escape the crushing humiliation radiating from the crowd. Her heel caught the thick linen tablecloth of a nearby catering station. She stumbled backward, crashing heavily into the table. A towering display of silver serving trays and crystal appetizer plates cascaded onto the floor with a deafening clatter. Nobody rushed forward to assist Brenda. The wealthy elites, recognizing the toxicity of the trio, simply took a synchronized collective step back, leaving Bradley, Meredith, and Brenda entirely isolated in a wide circle of public disgrace. They looked like terrified trespassers, caught in a place they did not belong, standing amidst shattered glass and spilled food. Caroline did not spare them a single glance of pity. She began to walk. She moved with the effortless grace and lethal precision of a commanding officer inspecting a freshly conquered territory. The crowd parted for her, organically applauding with thunderous respect as she glided past them. She ascended the short flight of stairs to the stage, her posture immaculate, her presence demanding total submission. The applause died down as she reached the podium, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Caroline rested her hands lightly on the edges of the acrylic stand. She looked out over the ballroom, acknowledging the crowd of investors and executives. Then slowly and deliberately she lowered her gaze. She bypassed the wealthy socialites and locked her dark, unwavering eyes directly onto the shivering, ruined trio isolated on the floor below. Her gaze pinned Meredith in place like a butterfly on a mounting board. Caroline leaned into the microphone. Her voice was smooth, cold, and amplified to absolute perfection. "Welcome to my company, Meredith." Caroline stated the words, slicing through the silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "Let us talk about your performance review. The silence in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom was absolute, a suffocating vacuum created by the sudden, brutal shift in power. Hundreds of the most influential investors and corporate titans in Boston stared at the stage, captivated by the cold, undeniable authority radiating from Caroline. Down on the floor, Meredith was trembling violently, her crimson silk gown suddenly looking less like a symbol of dominance and more like a brightly painted target. Caroline raised a sleek silver remote in her right hand. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply pressed a single button. The massive digital screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage flared to life. The Aegis Global crest dissolved, replaced by a dizzying, highly detailed array of financial spreadsheets, bank transfers, and highlighted audit logs. The numbers were staggering, painted in stark red against a harsh white background. The sheer volume of data illuminated the ballroom in a harsh, unforgiving light. For the past 3 years, Caroline's voice boomed through the pristine audio system, commanding the room with absolute precision. Vanguard Tech has been bleeding capital. Investors were told the losses were due to aggressive research and development. That was a lie. The truth was far more pedestrian. The capital was being systematically drained to fund the personal, exorbitant lifestyle of 2 people. She clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a specific series of offshore accounts, detailing wire transfers that matched the exact dates of Meredith's luxury vacations and Bradley's imported car purchases. Thanks to a comprehensive independent audit conducted by Mr. Elijah Sterling, the newly appointed Chief Financial Officer of Aegis Global, we have traced every single stolen dollar, Caroline announced, her eyes never leaving Bradley and Meredith. $7.4 million, siphoned through shell companies hidden in forged vendor invoices and entirely embezzled by the very people entrusted to protect this company. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the crowd of venture capitalists. To this room of billionaires, infidelity or social climbing was a minor faux pas. But stealing from investors was the ultimate unforgivable sin. The wealthy elites physically distanced themselves even further from Bradley and Meredith, treating them like a highly contagious disease. They stepped back, leaving the trio entirely isolated in the center of the floor. Bradley felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the massive screen, seeing his hidden offshore account numbers displayed for the entire financial district to read. The secret was out. Elijah had not just found the discrepancies, he had mapped the entire criminal enterprise with devastating, inescapable precision. Therefore, as my very first official act as the majority shareholder and absolute owner of Vanguard Tech, Caroline declared, her tone dropping to a register of pure ice, I am executing an immediate corporate restructuring. The former Vice President of Operations Meredith and the former manager Bradley Vance are terminated effectively immediately for gross embezzlement and corporate fraud. Caroline paused, allowing the crushing weight of the termination to settle over the room. You no longer have jobs. You no longer have equity. You no longer have access to the building. Furthermore, the complete unredacted audit files you see behind me were hand-delivered to the federal authorities at noon today. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Meredith. The illusion was dead. The money was gone. The federal investigators were coming. She looked at the faces of the billionaires surrounding her, seeing only profound disgust. She looked at Bradley, seeing a man whose ego had completely shattered into dust. If she lost Bradley, she lost her last remaining shield. She needed leverage. She needed a weapon, and she needed it right now. Meredith snapped. She shoved her way forward, practically climbing over the shattered crystal of Bradley's dropped champagne glass. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the stage, her voice rising to a hysterical, desperate shriek. You cannot do this to us! Meredith screamed, the shrill sound echoing harshly off the marble walls. You are just a bitter, jealous ex-wife. You are trying to ruin him because he chose me, but you cannot destroy us. Bradley and I are a real family. We are building a future. I am pregnant, Caroline. I am carrying Bradley's child, his heir. You cannot throw a pregnant woman onto the street. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. Brenda, who had been cowering near the ruined catering table, suddenly gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Bradley snapped his head toward Meredith, his eyes wide with sudden, desperate hope. A child. An heir. In his fractured, narcissistic mind, this was the ultimate validation, a biological reason to fight back against the nightmare unfolding around him. He took a half-step toward Meredith, ready to defend the mother of his future child. Caroline did not flinch. She did not look surprised. She simply watched Meredith flail with the detached curiosity of a scientist, observing an experiment reach its inevitable conclusion. An heir, Caroline repeated, her voice cutting effortlessly through the murmurs of the crowd. A beautiful sentiment, Meredith. A very powerful narrative to play for sympathy in front of an audience of your peers. There is just one significant problem with your timeline. Caroline pressed the button on her remote one final time. The financial audits on the massive screens vanished. In their place appeared a digitized, heavily redacted medical insurance claim. The Vanguard Tech corporate logo sat at the top of the document. Key dates and specific medical terminology were highlighted in bright, unavoidable yellow. "Are you?" Caroline asked, her voice echoing with chilling clarity. "Because Vanguard's corporate insurance claims show you had a bilateral tubal ligation fully covered by the company healthcare plan. You had your tubes tied 5 years ago, Meredith." The silence that descended upon the Ritz-Carlton was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. Bradley stopped breathing. He stared at the massive 50-foot screen, reading the medical terminology over and over again. The dates, the procedure, the undeniable proof submitted by Meredith herself to the corporate billing department half a decade ago. The truth slammed into him with the force of a freight train. The morning sickness, the secretive doctor appointments, the emotional manipulation she had used to force him into compliance over the last 2 months. It was all a complete fabrication. There was no baby. There was no heir. Meredith had never intended to start a family with him. She had manufactured the pregnancy solely to trap him, to secure her position, and to ensure he would never abandon her when the financial walls began to close in. Bradley slowly turned his head to look at the woman he had destroyed his entire life for. Meredith was frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream of absolute terror, staring up at the medical record that had just incinerated her final lie. Bradley stared at Meredith. The crimson silk gown, the haughty sneer, the promises of a technological dynasty, all of it instantly dissolved into the pathetic image of a cornered, penniless fraud. She was not a brilliant corporate strategist. She was a massive legal liability, and worse, she was completely broke. The federal indictments Caroline had just announced meant Meredith had nothing left to offer him but a shared prison sentence. Self-preservation, the only instinct Bradley truly possessed, took immediate control. He did not comfort the woman he had abandoned his marriage for. He shoved her away with a violent jerk of his shoulder. Meredith stumbled on her high heels, collapsing into a heap of red silk beside the ruined catering table, but Bradley did not spare her a second glance. He spun back to face the stage, his eyes wide, frantically searching his fractured mind for a lifeline. He looked up at Caroline, standing bathed in the crisp, white spotlight draped in emeralds and wielding absolute, terrifying power. In his twisted, narcissistic worldview, he saw a loophole. They were technically still married. The divorce decrees were not finalized. He was legally entitled to half of all marital assets, and if Aegis Global was worth billions, he was instantly a billionaire. He just had to play the victim. He scrambled forward to the base of the stage and fell heavily onto his knees. The harsh impact sent a jolt of pain up his legs, but he ignored it. He threw his hands out, his face contorted into a mask of manufactured desperate agony. "Caroline, my beautiful wife," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking with artificial emotion, echoing through the silent ballroom. "She tricked me. She manipulated everything. The forged documents, the missing funds, the hostility. It was all Meredith. I was blinded, Caroline. I was confused and taken advantage of by a predator." He crawled a few inches closer to the edge of the stage, entirely ignoring the collective gasp of disgust from the surrounding investors. He looked up at her, attempting to channel the boyish apologetic charm that had worked on her a decade ago. "We can fix this," Bradley begged, his voice rising in panic. "You and me. We are still married. The house, the money, half of Aegis Global is mine by marital right. We can merge everything properly. We can rebuild our lives and this empire together." Caroline looked down at him. She did not express anger. She did not yell. She simply unclasped the delicate gold lock of her emerald clutch. She reached inside and withdrew a single neatly folded piece of paper. The crisp rustle of the thick parchment sounded exceptionally loud in the dead quiet of the room. She unfolded it methodically, smoothing the creases with her thumb. "It is fascinating how memory works, Bradley," Caroline said, her voice projecting effortlessly through the microphone, washing over the captivated audience. "You seem to have completely forgotten the mediation session we held exactly 42 days ago. You were in quite a rush to finalize the separation of assets so you could finance your new life with your vice president." Bradley felt a cold spike of genuine terror pierce his chest. He stared at the paper in her hands, his breath catching in his throat. "You were so confident in the absolute dominance of Vanguard Tech." Caroline continued, her tone conversational but lethal. "You were so eager to keep every single share of your company that you demanded I sign away any claim to it. And in exchange to expedite the process, you blindly signed away your rights to my assets. Let me refresh your memory." Caroline lifted the document, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. "Section 4, Paragraph B of our binding court-approved mediation agreement," she announced clearly. "The document you signed without having your attorney review because you were too busy laughing at my, quote, worthless little defense startup." She looked directly into Bradley's eyes. "The husband Bradley Vance explicitly and irrevocably waives all present and future rights, titles, and interests in Aegis Global, its subsidiaries, holdings, and intellectual property. The husband acknowledges that he accepts total undivided ownership of Vanguard Tech in lieu of any claim to the wife's corporate assets, regardless of their current or future valuation." Caroline slowly lowered the paper, resting it on the acrylic podium. "You do not own half of Aegis Global, Bradley," Caroline stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "You own exactly 0%. You waived your marital rights to a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor in order to keep 100% of a company that is currently insolvent, federally audited, and entirely worthless." The mathematical reality of his own staggering arrogance crashed down upon Bradley. He had held $1 billion lottery ticket in his hands and set it on fire just to watch the ashes fall. He had traded a 50% stake in an international empire for a company he had simultaneously allowed his mistress to bankrupt. He had done it voluntarily. He had signed the paper himself. His fragile ego had literally cost him billions of dollars. A sound tore itself from Bradley's throat. It was not a word. It was a guttural, primal scream of absolute despair. He slammed his fists against the polished marble floor of the ballroom, his rented tuxedo jacket ripping at the seams as he convulsed with the sheer, unbearable agony of his own stupidity. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, a pathetic, visceral display of a broken man realizing he had engineered his own total destruction. Brenda, still sprawled near the ruined catering table, began to wail, covering her ears as her golden boy completely unraveled on the floor. Caroline did not flinch at the screaming. She simply stepped back from the podium. As if cued by her movement, the massive ornate oak doors at the back of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom swung open with a heavy, resounding thud. The crowd of wealthy investors instantly parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center of the room. Elijah, the newly appointed chief financial officer of Aegis Global, strode into the ballroom. He was not wearing his usual unassuming accountant's cardigan. He was wearing a sharp, perfectly tailored black suit, holding a thick leather briefcase, his expression entirely unreadable. Flanking him on either side, moving with synchronized tactical precision, were 6 agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their gold badges gleaming sharply against their dark jackets. They marched straight down the aisle, their eyes locked directly on the weeping man on the floor and the paralyzed woman in the crimson dress. The synchronized footsteps of the 6 federal agents echoed like a death knell across the marble floor. Elijah halted a few paces back, his posture relaxed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He watched with the clinical satisfaction of an auditor whose ledgers had finally balanced perfectly. The lead FBI agent stepped directly in front of Bradley, who was still kneeling amid the shattered glass, completely paralyzed by the reality of his own ruin. The agent did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute that his words carried to the furthest corners of the room. Bradley Vance and Meredith Hayes, you are both under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Before Bradley could even process the words, two agents hoisted him to his feet. They spun him around, slamming his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place cut through the room. Meredith shrieked a high and piercing sound of sheer terror. She tried to scramble backward on the polished floor, the heavy crimson silk of her rented designer gown tangling around her legs. An agent caught her by the arm, pulling her upright with effortless force. Her wrists were secured just as quickly. The glittering diamond bracelets she had bought with stolen Vanguard funds clicked harshly against the cold steel of the federal restraints. The Boston financial elite watched this spectacle with a mixture of morbid fascination and utter disgust. These were the power brokers of the city people who ruthlessly protected their wealth and their reputations. Seeing two blatant frauds paraded in restraints was a brutal reminder of the consequences of crossing the line. The venture capitalists, the senators, the socialites, they all collectively stepped back again, creating a wide corridor of shame for the prisoners. The sight of her golden boy in handcuffs finally broke Brenda. Her delusions of grandeur, her decades of enabling Bradley's worst impulses, and her relentless cruelty toward Caroline, all fractured in a single instant. She let out a guttural, wretched wail that sounded entirely inhuman. Brenda threw herself onto the floor, her outdated dress riding up awkwardly as she scrambled on her hands and knees toward the stage. "Caroline!" Brenda sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. She reached out, her fingers scraping against the base of the acrylic podium. "Caroline, please. You have to stop this. You are a billionaire. You have lawyers. You can fix this. He is your family. He is my son. Please, I am begging you. Give me the money for his defense. You owe him that much." Caroline stared down at the woman who had spent years making her life a living hell. She remembered the insults about her background, the relentless criticism of her ambition, and the sheer joy Brenda had taken in Caroline's supposed downfall. Caroline did not feel anger. She did not feel pity. She felt absolutely nothing at all. "I owe him exactly what he earned," Caroline stated, her voice as hard and polished as a diamond. She looked at the sobbing, pathetic woman, grasping at the stage. "Take your garbage and get out of my ballroom." The massive security chief materialized from the shadows, stepping forward with two equally imposing guards. He clamped a hand firmly onto Brenda's shoulder, dragging her to her feet with zero gentleness. Brenda thrashed and wailed, her makeup running down her face in thick black rivers, but she was entirely powerless. The FBI agents marched Bradley and Meredith down the wide, empty aisle created by the crowd. Bradley kept his head down, tears dripping from his chin, his arrogance entirely evaporated. Meredith sobbed hysterically, pleading with anyone who would make eye contact, but the billionaires simply turned their backs as she passed. Security marched Brenda right behind them. She reached out to her wealthy acquaintances, the people she had tried so desperately to impress all evening, but they looked through her as if she were made of glass. It was the ultimate social exile. The heavy oak doors at the back of the Ritz-Carlton slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate and silencing Brenda's wails for good. The ballroom released a collective held breath. A low murmur of genuine awe began to ripple through the crowd. They turned back to the stage, looking at Caroline with a new, profound level of respect and fear. She had not just defeated a hostile takeover. She had completely annihilated her enemies on a public stage, executing a masterclass in corporate vengeance. Elijah adjusted his suit jacket and walked calmly up the short flight of stairs to the stage. The murmurs quieted down as the brilliant CFO approached the podium. He did not speak into the microphone. He simply stepped up beside Caroline, reached into his leather briefcase, and pulled out a single heavily embossed document. He handed it to her, a faint knowing smile playing on his lips. Caroline accepted the document, her fingers tracing the heavy embossed seal of the Massachusetts family court. She did not open it to display to the crowd. This was not a corporate ledger or a federal indictment meant for public consumption. This was a deeply personal victory, quiet and absolute. She scanned the final page, her dark eyes landing on the frantic, jagged signature at the bottom. Paige Vance. Paige had always treated Elijah as a human. ATM. A dull accessory to fund her extravagant lifestyle, mirroring exactly how Bradley had once treated Caroline. But when Elijah handed over the forensic audit to the federal authorities, he had not just exposed Bradley and Meredith. He had meticulously traced the offshore accounts Paige used to funnel her own share of the embezzled corporate funds. Facing an immediate federal indictment for conspiracy and accessory to wire fraud, Paige's suffocating arrogance had crumbled in an instant. Terrified of a federal prison sentence, she had signed the divorce settlement unconditionally, relinquishing any claim to Elijah's assets, his pension, and his future. Elijah was completely, legally, and financially free. Caroline looked up from the freshly signed ink and met Elijah's gaze. For years, they had both existed in the background of the Vance family's delusional theater. They were the punchlines, the outcasts, the socially unacceptable dead weight, holding back the family's supposed greatness. Now they were the executioners. Caroline stepped back to the acrylic podium and adjusted the microphone. The ballroom, still reeling from the violent spectacle of the federal arrests and Brenda's pathetic banishment, fell into an immediate, breathless hush. The city's financial elite leaned forward, eager to align themselves with the new apex predator in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caroline's voice rang out, warm but commanding, a stark contrast to the icy tone she had used to dismantle her ex-husband. A corporate acquisition of this magnitude requires more than just capital. It requires absolute operational integrity. It requires a leadership team that cannot be bought, intimidated, or compromised. Aegis Global did not achieve its current market dominance by rewarding mediocrity, and we will not allow Vanguard Tech to languish in the ruins of its former management. She gestured gracefully to the man standing beside her in the immaculate black suit. The forensic deconstruction of Vanguard Tech was not a simple undertaking. It required a mind capable of untangling years of deliberately obfuscated financial records. It required brilliance, precision, and unwavering ethics. The man standing beside me possesses all three in abundance. Elijah stood tall, his posture no longer slumped under the weight of his ex-wife's constant belittling. The brilliant accountant had permanently stepped out of the shadows. Effective immediately, Caroline announced, the pristine acoustics of the ballroom carrying her words to the furthest velvet-draped corners. Vanguard Tech is officially a subsidiary of Aegis Global, and as my second act as majority shareholder, it is my distinct honor to introduce the man who will be leading its complete financial restructuring. Please welcome the new Chief Financial Officer of Vanguard Tech, Mr. Elijah Sterling. The applause started in the front row, initiated by Senator Sterling, and rapidly cascaded through the entire Ritz-Carlton ballroom. It was deafening. The venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and angel investors clapped with ferocious enthusiasm, instantly recognizing the brilliant strategic maneuver. Caroline had not just purged the rot from Vanguard. She had installed a financial genius at the helm to rebuild it. Amidst the thunderous standing ovation, Caroline turned to Elijah. She extended her right hand. Elijah met it with a firm, confident grip. It was a simple, professional gesture, but the unspoken weight behind it was monumental. It was a pact between two survivors. Two people who had been systematically treated as worthless outsiders, discarded by a family built on narcissism and deceit, were now the undisputed rulers of the empire. They had won. The toxic machinery of their past had been dismantled, replaced by an enterprise built purely on their own merit. Caroline offered him a genuine, approving nod, stepping back to let Elijah absorb the applause that was entirely his own. The master of ceremonies stepped forward to take the podium, signaling the transition into the celebratory phase of the gala. The heavy lifting was done. The boardroom had been cleansed. Caroline turned away from the stage. She moved down the short staircase and began her final walk through the ballroom. The crowd parted for her once again, but the energy had shifted completely. There was no more whispered gossip, no more condescending stares. The elite of Boston bowed their heads in deference as she passed. Venture capitalists pressed sleek business cards into the hands of her security detail, begging for a fraction of her time. She acknowledged them with polite, minimal nods, moving with the effortless grace of a queen departing her court. She walked past the shattered glass of Bradley's champagne flute, past the overturned catering table where Brenda had wailed in defeat, and straight through the massive oak double doors. The heavy soundproofing of the Ritz-Carlton lobby immediately dampened the roar of the applause behind her. Flanked by her security team, Caroline pushed through the revolving brass doors of the hotel and stepped out into the night. She paused on the top step, taking a deep, unhurried breath. 7 years ago, she had been thrown out of a house in the middle of a blinding, freezing blizzard, carrying nothing but a trash bag of cheap clothes and a broken heart. She had nearly frozen to death in the snow, a victim of her own misplaced loyalty and Bradley's rampant greed. Tonight there was no storm. The Boston sky was calm and spectacularly clear, the stars burning bright and steady against the vast expanse of black. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh, clean scent of the harbor. A pristine, phantom black Rolls-Royce idled smoothly at the base of the red-carpeted stairs. Her uniformed chauffeur, a stoic man who had driven her for the past 3 years, immediately stepped forward and opened the heavy rear door. Caroline did not look back at the hotel. She smoothed the emerald silk of her gown, stepped into the luxurious leather interior of her own car, and let the door close softly behind her. The heavy armored door of the phantom Rolls-Royce glided shut, sealing Caroline in a soundproof cocoon of immaculate leather and polished walnut. The chaotic energy of the Ritz-Carlton, the flashing lights of the federal vehicles, and the lingering echoes of Bradley's pathetic screams were instantly severed. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the quiet Boston night, Caroline poured herself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled center console. She took a slow sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the last remaining traces of the evening's tension. Her heart rate was remarkably steady. There was no lingering adrenaline, no frantic high of vengeance, no trembling hands. There was only a profound settling peace. It was the absolute tranquility that arrives when a massive outstanding debt has finally been paid in full down to the very last cent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, transitioning from the harsh artificial glare of the financial district to the serene sweeping darkness of the Atlantic coastline. She watched the reflection of her emerald gown in the glass. 7 years ago, she had been discarded into a blinding, freezing blizzard, shivering in a thin coat carrying nothing but a trash bag of cheap clothes and a shattered heart. She had been treated as disposable, a temporary inconvenience, to be swept aside for Meredith's grand entrance. Tonight the air outside was crisp, calm, and spectacularly clear. The stars burned bright and steady against the vast expanse of black guiding her home. The car turned off the main coastal highway, gliding onto a private winding road lined with towering ancient evergreens. At the end of the 2-mile drive, massive wrought iron gates stood guard. They parted silently as the vehicle approached, monitored by an elite round-the-clock security detail, utilizing the very surveillance technology Aegis Global had pioneered. The coastal estate came into view, bathed in soft architectural lighting. It was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of imported stone and floor-to-ceiling glass perched high on a rugged cliff overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks below, a steady, powerful heartbeat. This was her fortress. She had not married into it. She had not inherited it. She had built it stone by stone, dollar by dollar, entirely on her own merit. Caroline stepped out of the car, the cool, salty air kissing her skin. She walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, bypassing the grand sweeping staircase and the formal living areas. The air inside was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of lavender and sea salt. She moved purposefully down the plush carpeted hallway of the East Wing, her silk gown whispering softly against the floor. She pushed open a heavy white door and stepped into the nursery. The room was a sanctuary bathed in the soft, warm glow of a starlight projector painting quiet constellations across the ceiling. Two identical handcrafted cribs sat in the center of the room. Caroline approached them silently, her posture softening for the first time all evening. She looked down at her sleeping twins, a boy and a girl, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect peaceful synchronization. A fierce protective warmth swelled in her chest. They were completely oblivious to the empire their mother commanded. They were oblivious to the corporate bloodbath that had just taken place miles away. Most importantly, they were entirely safe from the toxic bloodline she had just severed forever. Bradley would never know them. Brenda would never taint them with her narcissistic poison. They would never be made to feel like outsiders in their own home. They would never be told they were worthless or disposable. They would grow up wrapped in absolute security, immense wealth, and fierce, unconditional love. They were the true heirs, not to a crumbling, embezzled tech firm built on lies, but to a legacy of pure resilience. Caroline reached down gently, brushing a soft dark curl from her daughter's forehead. Looking at them, she reflected on the true nature of power. Society often confused power with volume. Meredith had believed power was a loud, screeching demand in a hotel lobby. Bradley believed power was an arrogant smirk and a rented tuxedo. Brenda believed power was belittling those beneath her social station. But they were all wrong. True power is never loud. It does not need to scream for attention. True power is entirely silent. It is the brutal, unwavering discipline to hold your tongue when you are insulted. It is the ability to harness your humiliation, to swallow your tears, and to channel that raw agony into a relentless, invisible momentum. Power is building your fortress in the dark, laying every brick with calculated, obsessive precision. It is smiling politely at your enemies while you quietly buy the ground they stand on, waiting patiently until your walls are impenetrable before you finally drop the drawbridge. And she had learned the absolute truth about family. The people who share your DNA are not automatically your family. Blood means nothing if it is laced with venom and deceit. Family is not defined by a marriage certificate or a shared last name that someone attempts to leverage for a payout. Family is defined by action. Family is the people who hand you a coat when you are freezing in a blizzard. Family is the people who stand beside you in the trenches, who help you audit the unauditable, and who build the empire with you in the shadows. She had forged her own family, and it was unbreakable. She stood by the cribs for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of their breathing. The ghosts of her past were gone, locked away in federal holding cells, their reputations incinerated, banished to the fringes of society where they belonged. The slate was completely, beautifully clean. Caroline pressed a soft kiss to her fingertips and touched the wooden edge of each crib. She turned and walked out of the nursery, leaving the door slightly ajar, stepping forward into the bright, unwritten future she had fought so ruthlessly to secure. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but occasionally you have to buy the garbage company to make sure it happens. Have you ever had a partner underestimate you only to regret it for the rest of their life? Tell me your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of surviving, thriving, and conquering. The most profound lesson from these stories is that true worth never comes from the validation of a toxic family. For years, these resilient women endured cruel comparisons, blatant favoritism, and heartbreaking exclusion. Yet instead of surrendering to their assigned roles as scapegoats, they channeled their pain into quiet, unstoppable ambition. They built their own fortresses of success in absolute silence. When the moment of truth arrived, they did not need to shout to prove their power. Their undeniable achievements spoke for themselves. Reclaim your inner strength, break free from toxic expectations, and share your journey in the comments below.